مساء النور. السلام عليكم والسلام عليكم. سنبدأ جلسة أو جلسة نقاشية.
We will start our panel. It's going to be about manipulating news and the threatened democracies. We will be hosting in this panel scholars and investigators. We have Mrs. Irina Khan, the Special UN Rapporteur on enhancing the right of freedom to expression. And Khan is considered to be one of the defenders of human rights and gender equality. And she was the Secretary General of Amnesty International, and she was their executive director for years. You're most welcome, Mrs. Irene. And we also have with us Madam Angie Holland, the head of the ICPN network, and she also launched a specialized website that called Political Facts. We're going to talk more about her experience with this website. You're most welcome, Mrs. Angie. And we have Gillian Kishler, who's a journalist and a writer and a fact checker in the Washington Post. He also launched the Nuclear Index, and we will see that in detail. We will see how he prepared it. And finally, we have with us Chris Morris. He worked in BBC, and he launched the reality check program on BBC. And he's a seasoned journalist in the area of fact-checking. I'm Anas Ghandarif, the facilitator. I am a consultant for the AU in covering news and its relationship with disinformation. We're going to start our discussion by asking Mrs. Khan, you work on the right to expression, and here I refer to Article 19. How can we work on defending human rights and right to expression and its relationship to disinformation in a time of elections? How do you deal with this duality?
Thank you. I think it's particularly important in times of elections, at a time when the political scene is very fragile, that freedom of expression is respected. Freedom of expression is vital for elections because it allows politicians, candidates who are standing for election, to put forward their information. It also allows the public to engage in debate. It allows media to play a part in that conversation. Unfortunately, in the modern age, freedom of expression is being challenged by digital technology. Freedom of expression is not an absolute right. It can be restricted, for example, to protect your reputation, defamation, or to protect national security or public morals or public health. But those restrictions, and hate speech has to be prohibited, but those restrictions have to be applied very narrowly, because otherwise, you will be restricting legitimate expression. And the problem with disinformation is there is no agreed definition of disinformation. What I consider disinformation, you may consider legitimate criticism. And that is why it's extremely dangerous times during elections when governments use that opening to actually restrict legitimate expression. For example, criticism of the party in political power is usually seen as disinformation, and therefore the so-called fake news laws that are used to lock up journalists who report on government policies. So it's a very dangerous age in which we are living, but all the more important that we stand up for the international standards on freedom of expression.
شكرا لك سيدة إيرين. لننتقل ذلك إلى الزميلة إنجي هولند التي تقود شبكة كبيرة ضخمة من المدققي الحقائق.
Let's go to our colleague Angie Holland. This issue of freedom of expression and the limitation of this and disinformation, especially in this age of technology, how can you, as a network, How can you debunk those disinformations? Do you have some specific strategies that you follow?
Yes, most of the fact checkers in our network, the International Fact Checking Network, have methodologies that they've developed over time. They're published methodologies about how they go about selecting claims to check and using evidence that is independent and can be replicated. Every fact check is a little bit different. Some fact checks involve a large body of evidence where the findings are very clear. Some fact checks involve new or emerging issues where the body of evidence is small, and fact checkers have to be very nuanced in how they convey uncertainty. One issue that I see all of our fact checkers dealing with in many different ways is the freedom of expression that Irene mentioned. In some places, fact checkers have been attacked on the premise that fact checking is somehow inhibiting the speaker's speech, but our position is that fact checking adds to the public conversation. It doesn't detract from it. At our fact checkers conference in Sarajevo this summer, the fact checkers gathered together to issue a statement stating how much they favor freedom of expression, how important it is to fact checking, and that fact checking is not censorship in any way. So we believe that with our published methodologies where we emphasize the independent sourcing and showing the sourcing to the audience so that anyone can investigate the fact check for themselves, that is the common methodology that's emerging around the world.
شكرا السيدة إنجي.
Thanks, Inji. A question, maybe a satirical question to our colleague Glenn, which is the Pinocchio Index. The Pinocchio, Pinocchio is this cartoon character that we used to watch as children. When he lies, his nose would grow. You launched this index. Tell us about it and how do people deal with this index, and who is going to win your award of 2024? Because in 2023, you already gave away that award.
Yes, so at the Washington Post, we use what we call a Pinocchio scale, and that helps us give a bottom line assessment about the accuracy of a claim. It's a bit like a reverse restaurant review. So, if you go to a really good restaurant, it might win 4 stars from the restaurant reviewer. So at the Washington Post, if you tell a really egregious misstatement, what some people call a lie, you will earn 4 Pinocchios. We do it with numbers. A growing nose was deemed, the Washington Post is a family newspaper, so a growing nose was considered a bit too phallic. So 3 Pinocchios is something that is mostly false. 2 Pinocchios is something that is half true. 1 Pinocchio would be something that is almost close to being true. And we also have something called the Geppetto checkmark, which is reserved for statements made by politicians that are unexpectedly true, where you hear it and you think, well, that has to be false, but actually it's something that turns out to be true. And the reason we do this, some people have written that these Pinocchios are kind of silly or frivolous, but I think it's a helpful guide for readers if they just want to remember what our bottom line assessment is. And in Washington, the Pinocchios have a certain amount of power. Like, people don't want to get 4 Pinocchios. I've had politicians call me up asking me what can they do to prevent getting more Pinocchios, which usually ends up being just tell the truth. Now, one politician that seems fascinated by the Pinocchios, because when he was president before, he spoke about them constantly, but it doesn't seem to care that he gets lots of Pinocchios. His name is Donald Trump. So he almost always earns 4 Pinocchios over and over. And I regret to say that His track record in the campaign suggests he will continue to do that as president.
شكرا على هذا الشرح. ننتقل الى كريس موريس. كريس يعني
Thanks. Let's go to Chris Morris. We read a lot of your reports that spoke about the intersection of technology and journalism, the impact of algorithm, and the impact of artificial intelligence on the amplification of disinformation. And how can we hold those mega companies accountable? There are journalists who can hold those giants accountable for the amplification of disinformation.
Yeah, I mean, technology is a challenge because I think we know it is probably the greatest spreader of mis and disinformation at the moment. We've seen that over the last 10 years with the rise of social media and now the coming age of generative AI. But at full fact, we're also convinced that technology has to be part of the solution, because only by using technology can you challenge misinformation at internet scale. And that's a particular challenge during elections, because elections are times when there are people making speeches all over the place, there are articles, there are radio shows, there are TV debates, and how does a small team of human beings actually cope with that much information coming at them? We know there's going to be good information in there, but there's also going to be bad information. And if you can use the technology, as Full Fact has done with its AI tools, and our tools have been used in 11 elections around the world this year, it gives human beings a chance to sort of deal with that internet scale. The machines don't replace the human beings. The machines help the human beings, point them towards the information they really need to look at. And so, there is a bit of an arms race going on in information. I think we all know that. And probably at the moment, the bad guys are winning. But we have to use technology smartly to make sure that the issues that Irene was talking about, the importance of freedom of information and getting the right balance between protecting freedom of information on the one hand and protecting people from harm online, making sure that balance is right.
شكرا على الإجابة المقتضبة.
Thanks a lot for your brief answer. Let's go back to Glenn, because Glenn, you spoke about the Pinocchio Index and its impact on the politicians in the U.S. You documented more than 3,000 lies delivered by Trump when he was president, and at the end we see that Trump won the elections. Don't you feel disappointed that you didn't have this impact? The people at the end of the day, they chose someone that you classified as a liar?
I always say Americans get the president they deserve. You have to accept the results of an election, and it's clear that for many voters for Donald Trump, the fact that he lies doesn't really matter. The Washington Post has done some polling, and where we were able to show that supporters of Donald Trump could identify what his lies were. They could identify that this was not true. But at the same time, they still did not waver in their support of him. And to some extent, I think that supporters of Trump are voting for a kind of an attitude or a position. It's a little or a particular, stance, as opposed to the kind of thing that we as fact checkers look at, which is this accurate? Is this statement correct? And he uses his exaggerations as a way to motivate his voters. In a way that I don't think we've often seen politicians do. Because before Trump, at least in the United States, many politicians, while they might exaggerate, would try to keep their statements within the realm of possibility. And Trump, he's a former, he was a hypester businessman, and that's what you need to do in real estate. And so it's just, he just wants to make the sale. And so you're right. When in his first term, we documented more than 30,000 false and misleading statements he made. And yet, it didn't really seem to matter to the people that voted for him. And I should note that I don't do right fact checks to change either the behavior of politicians or to change people's opinions. It's simply to present the right, correct information, and what people choose to do with that is really up to them.
Yeah. يعني نفس الموضوع ولكن بطريقة أخرى
The same thing, but let's ask the question in a different way to our colleague Angie. Last year, it was an election year. Two-thirds of the globe went to the polling stations to choose their representatives. This means that there was a lot of dissemination of disinformation, and maybe there was information that could have impacted the democratic process. Your network that worked on the elections, did you have a feeling of disappointment at the end of the day because lies won over the truth, and taking harm? The same level of disappointment that the journalists write an investigative story where they think that they caught the responsible red-handed, but then nothing happens. Did you feel like that in the time of elections?
I think that fact checkers around the world are facing a lot of pressures. First, it seems like there's been an increase of lies, hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and it seems to be coming not only from the internet, but also from the candidates themselves. So there's a lot to fact check, and sometimes it does seem like the lies are on the march and have the upper hand. But I think a lot of the fact checkers who are in this work are motivated by the pursuit of the truth. And I think that's really that ethical commitment to truth as a first priority is really important, and what makes us journalists as opposed to advocates or party officials or people who are trying to influence a certain outlook. The idea is because we have this ethical commitment to truth first, we can pursue the facts in a more thorough manner. And I think that's one of the classic ideas behind journalism, but the idea is under pressure. As far as disappointment, I think we've seen mixed results in elections this year. I don't think that liars always win. I think sometimes we see truthful candidates win, and it depends on the culture, the context, the specific circumstances. I do think around the world we are seeing several pressures that are common, and one of the top is economic pressures. People are concerned about their cost of living and how much they can earn to support their families. That is a very common concern. Another common concern is immigration, people crossing borders, nations that are accepting immigrants or don't want to accept immigrants. And those are huge pressures, and I think voters have those issues on their mind, not a more abstract exercise of is the candidate truthful or not. I think it's one factor, but I think voters are people and they have a lot of complex motivations and they weigh things very differently. When I talk to fact checkers and they're discouraged, I just remind them that we're in a service profession of trying to get people the right information. I don't think we can get overly invested in the outcomes. Because if we were very, very concerned with outcomes, I think we should leave journalism and go into the advocacy roles. Those are very appropriate and proper roles in a democratic society. But I would argue that it's not the role for information professionals who are trying to give good information.
Okay, great. شكرا. حكم اشتغالي على عدة انتخابات في
on different elections, especially in the past year. And now we refrained from giving recommendations to countries in order to digitalize the or to legitimize the digital arena. Most of dictatorship countries use the policies to limit the freedom of expression. Ms. Irina, you are working with governments, with countries. So this is a dilemma, an ethical one. How can you face it? We have misinformation spreading out, and we're asking the government to legitimize the digital sphere, but they use it to limit our expression, freedom of.
Well, as I said, digital technology has both good and bad side of it. It's extremely important place where
Sorry, can you move the
it's a very important space where people can share information, but it's also a dangerous space at times. So what my advice to governments is smart regulation. Not just regulation, it's a very blunt instrument, not censorship, because if you censor, the disinformation doesn't disappear, it just goes underground and becomes even more dangerous. So use smart regulation, and that means, for example, go get the companies. The companies have both control over speech and control over reach. So get companies to do proper content moderation, and there are many ways in which they can do it without removing the information, for example, by indicating other good sources or tagging them and so on. And also get the companies to use their reach, the algorithms, to determine how they manage it. So they have a responsibility, I think, particularly during elections. The other thing that as I was listening to my colleagues on the panel that occurred to me is that, we've gone beyond the issue of just truth and lies. As a number of the panelists have said, people don't care about truth or lies. But what's happening is, the sources are changing. We have always, and we are, of course, looking at what politicians say. But if you look at recent elections over the past year, the influencers have played a much bigger role than politicians. And they are, of course, they have a commercial interest in spreading the information. And that is where I think it's extremely important for platforms to move in. Platforms have limited political advertisements, certainly in the European Union and places like that because of regulation, but they allow the influencers and they're making money out of those ads. So there's a lot of money behind this business of disinformation that we need to fix. The other point is that recent data on elections also are looking at how young people are voting, the first-time voters. Young people are using the digital technology, and there are more and more, of course, young voters than older voters. So it's extremely important. The digital sphere is extremely important for elections, but you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can actually use smart regulation to control harmful information while allowing still freedom of speech.
شكرا لك سيدة إيرينا. الآن يعني
Thank you, Ms. Irina. I have a question now. Any person can intervene now. The idea is as follows. We focus a lot on the tools for combating misinformation at the expense of the narrative. So we can produce content without misinformation, without fake news, but it's biased, framed, and with prejudice. So we are focusing a lot on tools instead of going to the real essence of journalism. We find this a lot in editorial or in the editing room, especially when it comes to covering the Palestinian case. You're working as editors. Is this a problem to be discussed? Is it a problem concerning you? And why we're focusing more on the tools instead of focusing on the principles of journalism? Please feel free to answer, any of you.
I think we have to accept we're in a new technological era, and so the tools are there whether we like it or not. That's number one. You're right, that doesn't mean we should forget the first principles of journalism. But I'd go back to something that Glenn said. I think it's important for any society to have some sort of basis of shared facts on which to have political debate. I don't care what opinion people may have on the facts we produce, but I would like them to agree that there are some shared facts that we start that debate from. And I think it's really important to say that organisations like ours are not trying to tell people what to think. They're trying to give them the tools to think for themselves so they can make informed decisions on the issues that matter to them, that matter to their families. And that kind of should be the basic building block of democracy. And I know what you mean. It's almost like the technology can get in the way. There's a danger of that. And the old style of reporting of, you just have to go somewhere and see it for yourself with your own eyes. There's a danger of that sort of drifting away. And that's partly economic. It's partly when people are prevented from going into certain places. But the technology is there. And so we have to think about the smart ways to use it most effectively.
Yeah, one thing I've reflected on while coming to ARIJ and seeing for instance, I saw the virtual reality movie of being in Gaza. Yeah, with technology, the kind of technology, the fact that in everyone's pocket now is a camera that provides geolocation, this has made it much more difficult for the Israeli government to shut off news coverage of what is happening in Gaza. I mean, they have, as has been documented, they've managed to kill almost 200 Palestinian journalists. They have prevented journalists from the Washington Post and other, European and American news agencies from being there. But everyone in Gaza now is a witness, and they are able to document what is happening in Gaza with their phones. Those phones can be geolocated, and so we have visual forensics experts at the Washington Post who have documented in detail what the Israeli government says is not correct, and have been able to expose the kind of propaganda that often happens in war, but is really much more difficult now. So I think that's an example of where modern technology, just the kind of technologies that are available that were not available 20 years ago, has made it more difficult for a government to cover up what it's doing. Even though there are very few journalists left there to report.
Oh, okay,
But
please.
I think it's also, you're absolutely right. But the same phones will carry any message you put in it, right? So you have people witnessing war crimes using the phones, people also using the phones to spread hate speech, for example.
Right, exactly.
So
exactly.
that's the danger there. And so in terms of approaching disinformation in the context of elections or in any context, you need multiple tools. Fact-checking is a very important one, and fast fact-checking rapidly. That's extremely important, but it is one element. The other is the diversity of media. We talked about editorials. No editorial is right or wrong. It depends on your point of view and other issues. So diversity of media, and there you go into media ownership, for example, media monopolies. Governments have a role there to ensure that the media monopolies don't grow. Governments also have a role in ensuring independent media is free to report different kinds of independent media. And the third element is the user, the listener, and media literacy is equally important, especially for young people. So I think it's a mixed bag of things with which we will be able to deal with disinformation in the context of elections.
Yeah, إنجي just لكي نتحول إلى النقاش قبل فتح ربما الأسئلة.
Before speaking about or before giving the room for the public to ask questions, I have a question to you. Do governments control these mega companies? Because in the EU we have mechanisms and Digital Service Act and GDPR, but these mechanisms do not exist in America or China. So there is a gap, and this gap says that those big companies are controlling the governments, and today the governments are followers to the trend, not trendsetters. How can we address this problem? And then the audience can ask questions. Go ahead.
Yes, I see the tech platforms and the governments like two giants that are wrestling each other. And sometimes it seems that one has the advantage, and sometimes it seems like the other one has the advantage. They're very powerful societal forces. And I think my personal view on technology is a neutral tool, and human beings can use technology to do good things, to promote human flourishing, or to do bad things that are harmful to health and prosperity. So it's how we use these tools. But I do think that when we're talking about the goal of what I like to call information integrity, accurate, verifiable information that's easy to access, every sector of society has a role to play in that. And just to echo Irene's comments on media literacy, I think journalists need to make sure to keep their critical thinking skills strong, but I think the audience needs to keep its critical thinking skills strong. We need people who are civic-minded, who are interested in being informed. And frankly, that comes, I think, from the educational system as a foundation. So I do like to see a whole of society approach when we're talking about promoting information integrity.
Thank you very much. Please, Chris.
Just one thing to add briefly, because it's something I think you asked me in your first question, I don't think I quite answered it, is there something more the big internet platforms could do with us? And let's make no mistake, these are the most powerful private corporations that have ever existed in the world. The one thing they could do, and we talk to them about this all the time, and they don't do it, is give us more access to their data. They have enormous amounts of information and data about where misinformation comes from, how narratives develop, what are the most effective ways of suppressing dangerous or harmful information, and they don't tell us enough about that. And the reason they don't tell us enough about that is that is their secret sauce. That's the algorithm. That's what they have that makes money for them. So there's this constant tension. I think they probably have very, very expensive lawyers saying, whatever you do, don't release the data. But we're asking for the data because that is the most effective way to make sure that the bad information doesn't spread and cause people harm.
Okay, شكرا.
Do you have any questions? The audience, do you have any questions?
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really honored to meet you. Thank you for being committed to the truth. My question is, regarding democracy and misinformation, how does Israel promote itself to the people, including journalists in the West, as a democracy, while giving and spreading false information all the time? I mean, how do the people still defend it sometimes, and some journalists still take its side while there's a lot of misinformation? Thank you.
Okay, I think we will take the second question and then we'll give the floor.
The question is for Ms. Khan. You drew a sharp distinction between regular law and smart law. Can you give an example about the two and how they would be used in third world countries? Thank you.
Yeah, the first question was about framing, and the second question about the distinction. I don't know if you get it. Anyway, please go ahead. If لو في حد فيكم يحب ياخذ الكلمة.
Yeah, I think in the United States there's increasing awareness of Israel's propaganda, and historically the United States and Israel have been allies, and there's been a lot of sympathy for Israel in the US, but during this conflict, I think we have seen rising voices in the United States pointing out what our questioner raised, which is that Israel does have propaganda and powerful propaganda tools, and they're used. And I think that the journalism in the United States is reflecting more skepticism of Israel, whereas before they may have given it more of the benefit of the doubt. So I think it's an evolving situation. In the United States, the conflict is a very contentious, heavily scrutinized issue with charges of bias on all sides. But I do think that, in my personal opinion, that the reporting is improving on the conflict overall. I think there's just heightened awareness of how important it is to get proper sourcing and evidence. Glenn mentioned the accuracy of the reporting, how that's been very problematic since so many journalists have been forbidden from going into Gaza. But I do think that there is an awareness that journalists have to be very careful in reporting the issue that maybe they didn't have, or they didn't have it at such a level before. The other issue on regulation, I mean, I would defer to Irene, but I do just want to say that it's very complex because I have seen one government take concerns about misinformation and use it to enact very good regulation that's helpful, that allows freedom of speech. And I've seen governments take the very same language and concerns and use it to suppress speech. So it's a very nuanced and contextual kind of problem. And I think there's not a one-size-fits solution for every country. And I think as journalists, we need to be careful not to take any of this kind of legislation at face value, but really, and especially when we're reporting about countries that are maybe not our own, to look really carefully and talk to local journalists and see what they think about how regulations affect freedom of expression. Because you can't just look at the language of the law and think you know exactly how it's being implemented, because these regulations have been applied in very different ways.
Thank you very much. Please, the second question, if one of you can answer.
I mean, just on the issue of regulation, it strikes me that we're in the equivalent of the early years of the Industrial Revolution. These are the first years of the information revolution. We haven't yet figured out how to do this properly yet, and this is a process that is going to last decades, I think. At the moment, in many parts of the world, we have allowed the very largest internet platforms to regulate themselves. And that's why debates are now beginning to spring up in different places in Europe. There's a new law being proposed and some really tough regulation coming in Australia, for example, about how you regulate information. In a democracy, the idea of regulating information can be quite uncomfortable. But I think, from my personal point of view, if you are going to regulate the internet in some way, I would rather it be done by, in the UK, for example, our elected representatives than by tech executives in California or in Beijing.
Shukran.
I actually might differ here. Let me start first with Israel and why Israel's propaganda is swallowed by so many people. You know, you have to look at the way in which the definition of anti-Semitism has evolved. In many Western countries, criticism of Israel is seen as anti-Semitic. And that creates a natural inclination, and sometimes by law, it's forbidden. So it creates a natural inclination not to criticize Israel for fear of being seen as anti-Semitic. That's a huge debate that I'm having currently with Western governments, because I think they've got it wrong. Political criticism of any government is legitimate freedom of expression. Coming back to regular laws versus smart laws, I think what you mean by regular law probably is law that censors content. Now, I would say that every country should not be allowed to determine what law is lawful, what speech is lawful and what is unlawful. That is what human rights are there for. They are universal, and universal standards, there is freedom of expression. It's not absolute. There are certain narrowly defined categories that need to be restricted because of their harmful impact. Now, applying that to the platforms, we have seen that, there is need to regulate platforms. I agree with that. But if you allow governments to regulate platforms, I think you will get very few UK-type bills and many more laws that exist in Egypt and Jordan and Bahrain, and I could go on naming countries in this region and outside this region that would be very blunt and very harmful to free speech. Even the UK law, there was huge pressure from civil society, from human rights organizations, from myself, from others in the UN, to get the UK to restrict it to really harmful offenses and not go beyond it. So I think regulating information is a very delicate and dangerous job. Governments are not always fit to do it. And that's why you have, for example, independent press commissions or media commissions in many countries, or self-regulation of print media. As far as digital is concerned, of course, because of the power of the companies, because of their commercial interests, because of the harm that can be done through massive, rapid amplification, there is need to control, but laws should not control the content. The content should be international standards of human rights. Companies should apply the same standards as the state. So the company should take care of it through content moderation. What companies can also do is look at amplification and see, where amplification. Some companies have done it. They've slowed down, for example, the ability to spread certain types of news too rapidly, and so on. So there are measures that companies can take, and that is what the Digital Services Act in Europe is trying to do. It is a heavy bureaucratic process, so not very applicable to developing countries. But I think in some developing countries also, there are tendency now to look more carefully. Leave content alone, apply human rights standards, and let the companies be more responsible about their content moderation and content dissemination.
أعتقد أن هذا النقاش سيظل مستمرا.
I believe that this discussion is a healthy discussion, and it will take more and more sessions. But unfortunately, we ran out of time. Thanks to Irene, to Angie, to Glenn and Chris, and we will continue our dialogue after this session, of course. Thanks a lot for being with us.